Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try to help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. Today I'd like to read a story from the First Testament, and it's found in the book of 2 Kings and chapter 5. It's the story of Naaman. Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Make the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call in the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned him off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant." The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." "Go in peace," Elisha said. Well, Naaman's story is a Sunday school favourite. It begins simply with a summary of his CV. We're told he was a great general and highly regarded because of his military skill and his successes on the battlefield. It's the next line that kind of produces a real shock, the first shock of the story. "For by him Yahweh had given victory to Aram." Excuse me. That simple statement has huge theological implications, for it tells us that the God of Israel also sovereignly directs what happens in Aram. It's the God of Israel who grants success to the Aramean military, even against Israel. It is he is the one who controls international politics and foreign affairs. And nor is this a unique occurrence of God's involvement and control of international affairs. Isaiah 45 verse 1 says, "This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him and to strip kings of their armour." The pagan king Cyrus is pictured here as God's right-hand man, fulfilling his purposes among the nations. In Jeremiah 27 verse 6 and 43 verse 10, God describes Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, as his servant. And so verse 1 tells us the astonishing truth that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is not merely the God of Israel, but that he directs the nations, and, as the story of Jonah suggests, he also holds the nations to account for their wickedness. As the psalmist writes, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. In our culture, a culture that has largely rejected the very idea of God's existence, the Bible's claim that God directs the geopolitical sphere is as much of a counter-cultural shock as it would have been for the king of Aram. Yet if ever there was a time that we needed to know and be assured that God is in control of international politics and the fate of nations and all the big stuff that's going on in our society and in our world, it's surely now. This new year has started with the risk of the war in Gaza escalating, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine grinding to a deadly stalemate, and natural disasters around the world, earthquake, fire and flood. To say that 2024 is going to be a year of change and uncertainty is something of an understatement, with half of the nations of the world, including our own, expected to have elections this year, some of which will have a global impact. I was in America a few months ago and saw firsthand how divided that nation has become. And they're at the start of an election year that is already so contentious that there's a genuine concern about it descending into violence, if not civil war. The cost of living crisis affecting millions of people in the UK is also expected to continue throughout the year, and the long-term impact of terrorist actions in the Red Sea could make that even worse. If we needed a reminder of the real-life impact of the climate crisis, 2024 has already provided it for us. In fact, earlier this week there were over 200 flood alert warnings in just one day in England and Wales. Now, if I'm painting a kind of bleak picture of 2024, the reality is I'm probably understating it. The fact is that we are living in tough times, with tough times ahead. Times of both national and international turmoil. And so I think we need to hear the story of Naaman. Naaman was a successful general and servant of the God of Israel, albeit unknowingly. But the statement in verse 1, "but he had leprosy," is a footnote in his life that makes a mockery of all that is implied in the first half of the verse. The word for leprosy there is a catch-all term that covered a variety of skin diseases, so we don't know what it was exactly. But it obviously wasn't contagious because Naaman took the arm of the king when he went to the temple. However, for all his success, power and prestige, this condition was a but in his life. And I guess that most, if not all of us, know what that feels like. Well, my life would be great, but the doctor's diagnosis wasn't good. I would be really happy, but my family life is a mess. My work's a disaster. It reminds me of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. We had hoped. Our lives have their fair share of dashed hopes, if only and but moments. However, if Naaman's story tells us nothing else, it tells us that all such moments are within the scope of God's purposes and power, and that he is not only in control of the big events of international affairs, but also of the small details of our lives, what we would consider both good and bad. As if in testimony to Naaman's military prowess, we are told that a young Israelite girl has been taken captive in one of their military victories. She was brought back to Aram and was put into service in Naaman's own household. Don't know anything about her, not even her name. But the whole story hinges not on Naaman the great general, but on this unnamed slave girl. She was probably from a family that was part of the remnant in Israel that still worshipped Yahweh. For she knew who Elisha was, and she clearly had faith in God that God could work through him to heal her master Naaman. It's easy to read verse 2 without grasping the human tragedy of that verse. Here's a little girl who's been violently and forcibly removed from her home and family, and it's certainly possible and likely that she witnessed her parents being killed and her home being destroyed. The Arameans were no more brutal than any of the other pagan nations, but they were no less so either. This little girl was witness to that brutality and violence, and then taken captive into another land where she would spend the rest of her life in servitude to her captors. It's a pretty horrible and pretty tragic story. And yet, in ways that no one could have imagined, it was God's sovereign grace to Naaman that he should raid Israel and capture this particular girl, bring her into his home. Her suffering and hardship would be the means of God's grace in bringing not only healing but salvation to Naaman. The word translated as victory in verse 1 is more literally salvation, so we're meant to read this as a salvation story. As Davis writes, she is testimony to the truth that people are often brought into the kingdom of God at great cost to other people. With the king's permission, Naaman sets off for Israel. And he probably assumed that any faith-healing prophet would be at the royal court, so that's where he headed with his entourage and his money and his letter of introduction. And of course the king of Israel wasn't very happy to see him. In fact, he went into a blind panic, assuming that the Arameans were looking for an excuse to start a war. The fact that it was Elisha who contacted the king of Israel and not the other way around suggests that whilst the king accepted that there was a God who had the power of life and death, he didn't have any real personal knowledge or confidence in that God. The contrast between the faithlessness of the king, the shepherd of Israel, and the faith of the servant girl is one of the many ironies in the story. Here the king represents the nation in more ways than one, for he reflects their godless attitude to life. As David comments, like the nation, he has the name of Israel, but not the faith of Israel. And I'm sure we all know people who have the name of Christ, but none of his spirit and character is evident in their lives. Elisha was completely unfazed when Naaman's entourage turned up at his door. In fact, he didn't even go out to greet him personally, but he sent a messenger with instructions telling Naaman what to do to be cured. But Naaman was furious, not only at the ludicrous instructions, but by the fact that they were delivered not by the prophet, but by his servant. When he says, "I thought he would surely come out to me," in the Hebrew, the "to me" is emphatic. It's as if, he's sort of saying, who does Elisha think he's talking to? Who do you think he's dealing with? I'm Naaman, the great Aramean general, great in valour, mighty in battle, held in great esteem by the king, and he sends out his servant. Not only that, but he never even got the whole prophetic healing experience. No prophet waving his hand over the afflicted area, calling out to God, praying in tongues and all that kind of stuff. All he got was a message from the prophet's servant telling him to go wash in the Jordan 7 times. He was disappointed and a bit annoyed, to say the least. He was raging. It's easy to be critical of Naaman, but I'm not sure actually that any of us are any different from Naaman. But we've been reminded here that God's ways are often offensive to us, and often reverse our expectations of how he works in the world and in our lives. And yet the Bible has plenty of examples of God working in ways that are contrary to our hopes or our expectations. Mary and Martha sent for Jesus, expecting him to heal their brother Lazarus, but Jesus deliberately delayed coming, and Lazarus died. When the sisters met him, independently of one another, they said, rather accusingly, if you had been here, well, come on, Jesus, if you'd been here, Lazarus would still be alive. It's your fault, Jesus, that Lazarus is dead. That's really what they were saying to him. Lack of faith was not the issue on their part, for they clearly believed in the power of Jesus to heal the sick. But they were disappointed and angry because it was failed to do what they had hoped, when they had hoped, and how they had hoped. If you read the Psalms, of course, you find such disappointments are all too common, and that the problem is not God, but rather our false expectations of how He works in our lives. He doesn't work according to our plan or our schedule. He directs local, national and global events to fulfill His purposes, not ours. As Bob Dylan puts it, God is not an errand boy to satisfy our wandering desires. And despite Naaman's objections, he's persuaded to follow Elisha's instructions, and when he does so, he's cured. He naturally returned to Elisha, and it soon becomes clear that not only has he been healed, but he's also been changed. This really is a salvation story. Naaman's salvation is evident in his renewed character. When he first came to Elisha, he was full of his own self-importance and his own expectations of how the God of Israel would work on his behalf. But now, well, not once, but 5 times when speaking to Elisha, he refers to himself as your servant. His changed attitude is also evident in his confession that Yahweh alone is the only true God, and that he will resolve to worship only Yahweh and Yahweh alone, even if that means taking 2 mule loads of Israeli dirt back home with him. Commenting on the change in Naaman, Davis writes that Naaman not only lost his leprosy that day at the Jordan, he lost his paganism as well. This was Naaman's, if you like, his born-again experience. Yet almost before he begins a life of worshipping Yahweh, Naaman appears to ask for an exception. When the king of Aram goes to worship in the temple of Rimmon, it is Naaman's duty to take his arm and to bow with him. In asking for pardon, he implies that although he must fulfill this duty, in his heart he will not be worshipping. And Elisha seems happy to give that advance pardon by telling him to go in peace. Naaman's story is a story for our times. It challenges us to realise that our conception of God is perhaps too small. And although world events may seem chaotically out of control, although the details of our small lives may at times be painful, confusing or unwelcome, God is in control of it all. And He is directing everything to fulfill His purposes. God is in control of the big things of the world and the small things of our lives. And although He does not work according to our hopes or expectations, it does not mean that He is not working in the events of our lives, both great and small, in the events of the world. And His work is always filled with grace and goodness, even if at the moment we can't see it. The Bible assures us that His purposes are for our good. And so although we don't always understand His ways, we don't need to be afraid. We just need to put our trust in Him. Trust in who He is and what His character is like. It's that truth that 2 Kings 5 is trying to teach us. And today, perhaps more than at any other time in history, it's a truth that we need to recover and hold fast to, even though it runs contrary to conventional thinking. As one writer puts it, we think that what determines the ruin or the prosperity of a nation are economic factors, political decisions, sociological shifts, technological advantages, military alignments and natural resources, all those sort of things. But no, it is the divine decree. It is whatever word Yahweh speaks through His prophet regarding a nation or a kingdom or an individual. It's no accident, I think, that the throne of God is mentioned 37 times in the book of Revelation. In chapter 7, John writes about a vast multitude from every tribe and nation who cry out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." In these tough times, we must turn our gaze to that throne and to the one who sits upon it and put our trust in him. Thanks for listening.